All right, well, why don't we get into it, because we only have an hour and I got so many things that I want to talk about with you. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our next edition of the Personal Histories and Conflict Resolution series. And I'm delighted today that we are hosting the wise and funny Peter Adler to learn all about his journey through the fields and hear some of his great stories. Actually, Peter, you know what's funny is as I was reading the essay that I shared with all of you from this book, which I love, is great. But I also highly encourage you to check out Peter's Peace Corps memoir. He's got a bunch of good books, but Peter and I were both in the Peace Corps. My Peace Corps adventures were not nearly as adventurous as his, but I was tempted, Peter, to just go through the India 40 and the Circle of Demons book and just tell all these stories. But maybe we'll just make that an anecdote as part of many other anecdotes. But one of the things that you start your chapter out with, and I love this, is good stories are hard to come by, and a good story you can call your own is an incredible gift. And as I was reading through all of this, Peter, I keep coming back to stories, telling stories, and what a storyteller you are too, and the writing that you do. And so I wanted to start with Robert COSBY, who you talk about, this professor that gave you your first moment. Tell me a little bit about COSBY. I love, you really evoke him very vividly in your chapter, but tell me the memories that pop to mind with that course. Yeah.
Context is I was a undergrad student at Roosevelt University in Chicago, which was a breakaway school from the University of Chicago. A bunch of radicals busted off from Chicago. And COSBY was a really interesting guy. I was actually majoring in science. I wanted to be a biologist, an aquatic biologist, but I accidentally wound up talking to COSBY and a couple other people and took some courses. And he taught a literature course in American literature, and he was quite an interesting character. He'd been involved in the Nuremberg trials in some smaller capacity. He was a veteran. But he was a very thoughtful and smart guy, and he just loved cracking students' heads open with paradigms and with contradictory things. And the story in there basically is that he started giving us kind of koans, puzzles, literary puzzles almost, that we had to deal with. And I don't know what you guys were like when you were undergrads, but I was in a binary world. It was all good, bad, right, wrong. This is the Vietnam era. And, that was my head. My head was, the world divides pretty neatly. And but he kind of started the change process, which continued later on. And he basically gave us a couple of examples and said, tell me about these. And we had to try to reconcile things that were not very reconcilable. And that was really the start. COSBY he became my advisor as I switched majors and went off into the social sciences and history and all that. So he was influenced. He was the first of a lot of mentors.
I love it. Yeah, I have one of my best friends from high school is a literature professor. And I often would joke with him and I would say, really, is this like, why is it important to make people read all these books? Like, I forgot all the books I read in school. Like, is it so important? And he said, look, Colin, my job is all these kids come in with black-white worldviews, and my job is to drown them in gray. And that's what literature is good for. It confuses people who are very certain about things. And it sounds to me like that's kind of what COSBY did for you. I loved when he called you a dolt. And,
he called everybody dolts. He was pretty harsh on to everybody. He didn't treat everybody as if they were little pieces of dirt, but with passion, with compassion.
Yeah, and you say in your chapter that the true sound of critical thinking at work is not aha, but huh? And you said that COSBY gave you one of your first real moments, right. A crunching sound in the world of binaries.
Yep, and it's what he started was a new kind of curiosity. That's what he started. And that kind of further developed in the India experience and a couple others.
Well, let's go there, because obviously I could talk all day about your Peace Corps experience, and you talk really vividly about it in your chapter. But looking back on your experience in India, how did that shape your journey into conflict resolution? You hadn't even been exposed to conflict resolution when you did Peace Corps. And I always thought it was interesting because I was exposed to dispute. I worked at the National Institute for Dispute Resolution before I did Peace Corps. And then when I went, I thought, well, this is great. Now I'm going to be a peacemaker. And I got there and there was no peacemaking to be done. That was like the last thing on my list of things to do. But how do you think that India experience
It wasn't, for
shaped you?
me, India wasn't about peacemaking at all. It was about chicken raising and rat killing and construction projects. And it was really down on the ground. But what I realized, what I think came through when I reflect on it and think back about it, is I learned a lot about another culture and a very imponderable place. I don't know if any of you've been to India, but it is a world of contradictions. And it's so interesting. And some people love it and some people hate it. But I mean, it's the rich and the poor, and it's the beautiful and the ugly. And it's just, you have to deal with these, contrasts that are just there and embedded. And I had 2 years to absorb that, and I did a lot of reading, by the way, on things that I hadn't read in college. But I think what it evoked was a new kind of outlook. It wasn't culture shock, it was life shock. Coming out of the American bubble and learning and seeing poverty and being a part of that, and watching people die. I mean, it was just, all of a sudden, it's like coming out of, some pampered bubble.
Yeah. I think we have some other returned volunteers on the call too. But I do think one of the things the Peace Corps does is you sort of think the world works a certain way, and then you go and you realize, oh, wait a minute, the world works lots of different ways, and the way that I thought it worked is not necessarily the way. And I get that a lot in some of what you're writing about India. I mean, it was just a completely different way to envision the role of a person on Earth.
Somebody back in the day, in the 60s, wrote a book, The Crack in the Cosmic Egg, or something like that. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what it was. It was the world cracked open in a new way. Yeah. And again, it just, I was moving from seeing the world in very closed binary ways: good, bad, right, wrong, beautiful, sure, ugly, old generation, new generation. I mean, it was all binary stuff when I was growing up. Right. And that changed. That started to change.
Absolutely. Well, and we may come back to Peace Corps, but you went from there. And I think the thing that's interesting is what brought you initially out to Hawaii was the Outward Bound program.
No, actually, it was because I married a local girl.
Okay, well, that'll do it too. That'll do it too. But yeah, talk about the move from India to Hawaii, and sort of what the stages of your life that went through.
Yeah, so the chronology is not that complicated. I mean, came back from the Peace Corps, did a master's degree at the University of Missouri, majored in sociology, which I also did a PhD in later on. Went to Boston, worked for 6 months in a management consulting firm, and really missed the more tropical environment and a different kind of environment. Boston wasn't for me. That's not to say anything for anybody who's from Boston, Godspeed and all that, but it just wasn't right. And my wife, Carolyn Watanabe, had grown up in Hawaii. She was from Hawaii, met her in the Peace Corps, and that's what took us back.
I see.
And then when I finished my PhD, I really learned that
I can.
1 second, Peter. I'm going to mute everybody.
Get off early.
And now you can unmute yourself. So, thank you. Just to get rid of some of the background noise. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, because I muted everybody.
Yeah,
there you go.
Long story short, I finished my degree, decided I really didn't want to be an academic. I thought that's where I was headed, and wound up in a kind of a intermission or interregnum or something, working in an Outward Bound school on the Big Island for a couple of years, which was really an adventure in many, many different ways, and quite loved it. And it was another one of those fork in the road experiences, a group of very close people working together to build something. And that's where I first got exposed to conflict management, conflict resolution.
Yeah, and my Hawaiian is terrible, so I know I'm going to butcher this word, but you talk about Oponopono.
That's right. Not bad. That's not bad.
Okay, well, I gave it a shot. Well, tell me a little bit about that. I mean, it sounds like that was your first exposure to traditional indigenous method for resolving disputes.
Yeah, it was, and we learned a version of it from some elders in a small coastal town called Miloli'i. Part of our expeditions were on the coast in outrigger canoes for 3 or 4 days, and we learned how to bring groups together when there was a conflict.
Mhm.
And it was an adapted version of Oponopono, which literally means to make things right. That's what the literal meaning is.
Mm.
And so we use that. We use that on these 24-day wilderness courses when people were getting snarky with each other. And that was really the first piece that really concretely touched the ground for me on conflict.
Yeah, and you said the idea of people sitting together under the guidance and choreography of an elder, peeling back the substantive and emotional layers of a problem and seeking to restore harmony in families and communities struck me as sensible and highly productive. And did you see in this like a role, like maybe this is something I want to do with my life?
I don't know if I was that broad about it, but what happened was that it was a real good segue into the world of mediation. And by the way, we have other people on here like Ricky and Diane and others who know a little bit about Ho'oponopono, but it wasn't, and since then, by the way, it's really evolved into a native Hawaiian practice that's much more robust than what we learned. So I don't claim to be expert. I don't claim to be a full-time practitioner. In fact, I wouldn't. Native Hawaiians need to do that.
Oh yeah. But you found your way to the Neighborhood Justice Center of Honolulu.
That's right. So Neighborhood Justice Center was just getting started. It was one of Griffin Bell's, post Pound Conference initiatives, and had a little bit of seed money. And so I applied to be executive director and got the job, and I loved it. I just loved it.
That's great. That's great. And it seems like a lot of the opportunities sort of spilled out from there. I mean, it seems like there was some kind of a switch that went off, and then you started working in a lot of related areas. You said you got appointed by the Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court to help develop and direct a newly established center for ADR. Can you talk about that?
Right. Yeah. So the guy who was the president of our board was a man named Lester Sincade. Ricky will remember Les. And Les was the administrative director of the courts, and he was really an interesting man. And he wanted to develop court mediation programs and arbitration programs in the courts. And he said, come work for me, come work for me and be part of it and help us do it. We want to do it. We don't quite know what to do. And that led to the Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution. He said, the only thing is, Peter, you can't wear flip-flops, you got to wear long pants, you got to wear shoes. And I went, I almost didn't do it and he said, stop riding that little motorcycle around. I mean, just, so I had to grow up a little bit more than I wanted to, but whatever.
I love that. I love that. And you describe your job as being a mediation catalytic converter. I remember when I worked with Tom Fee at NIDER, he was starting these statewide offices of mediation. And he would say, we want to be the catalyst. We want to go in there and catalyze a reaction. It's not about us making the change. It's about the people making the change, but we can assist them in accelerating the change. I don't know. It sounds
we were one of Tom and Bill Drake's experiments, and Bob Jones.
Great. I love it. And obviously that led to Keystone. So can you talk a little bit about, what took you to Keystone, what it was like working there, sort of the impact of your leadership at Keystone over 10 years. Talk about that chapter.
So one of the things that when I think back about life makes sense looking backwards. It never makes sense looking around at the moment or at the future. And when I look back, I kind of think part of what's motivated me has been the interest in developing ever more interesting applications of mediation to really complex problems. A friend of mine who I'm going to do a workshop with, he says there are three kinds of things. There's sort of algebra mediation, which are pretty formulaic. And then there's calculus, which are a little more complicated and messy. And then there's quantum, in which he thinks mostly it's bullshit because it's all politics and people lie a lot. So,
I love that.
So I've been very interested in the calculus and quantum. I've gotten more and more interested in complexity.
That's
and sometimes the problems are actually more interested in than the rapid solutions, and sticking with it and staying patient. So I wound up working on these kind of snarky, problems with exactly.
Science intensive, politically snarky disputes.
That's what I like. I like working on those. My friend Ken Lowry once called me a dispute seeking missile, And that's the stuff that motivates me. And it's not for everybody. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to do the next mediation on a family case or on a
Sure.
commercial problem. And I do some of those too. And so,
well, Peter, you're amongst your people here, so that's what I want to spend most of our time on, is getting into what that feels like to be inside. But let's finish the narration. I mean, I think Keystone, I mean, that must have been a really interesting change from the work that you had done in Hawaii. Obviously, you're dealing with a lot of DC types and think tank types and political people, and it must have been a challenge, sort of changing the gear.
well, what's interesting was I was approached. I was kind of recruited to go there. And I said, I'll go there for 3 years because I really didn't want, I like Hawaii. I love Hawaii. This is my community. These are my people.
Sure.
And my family's all here. I got a big extended family. And so I said, I'll come for 3 years. And basically I was there to help them reboot this mediation policy and mediation program, which was one part of what this Keystone Center did.
Yeah.
And while I was there, the guy that I reported to the president. I was a vice president. And basically he left. He got, mutually agreed with the board that he should leave. And they said, would you stay on? Would you stay on and be CEO? And I said, oh, well, okay. I mean, yeah, sure. At least for a while. And I wound up staying for 9 years. I was coming back and forth to Hawaii all the time anyway, but just to be with family and to work on a couple of projects and cases here. So, but it was really interesting because it was a bigger leadership challenge than I would have ever thought. The program had some serious problems. The whole center had some problems, which we dug our way out of mostly. And so I learned a lot. And I learned a lot that I couldn't be a mediator all the time as a leader. I couldn't do that. I wanted to be very consultative and engaging and participatory. And I learned to take a lot of consultation advice and then slowly make a decision and build it. And, change is hard. We know that. We know change is hard in organizations. And I'll just tell you one little story and then shut up. But at one point I was pushing along, to make a particular change in one of the programs. And so I had a meeting with all the senior staff. We had about 60 people in the organization. Had a meeting with all the staff. We talked, and I said, these are the things. Oh, we can't do that. Here's all the reasons why nothing will work, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. So the usual breaks on, the usual resistances to a serious change. So in my office, I had a big whiteboard on the wall. And when I was out of there, someone went in and wrote down, change is good, you go first. So actually, I figured out a way to go first and slowly move the agenda. But it was just really interesting because I had some really firecracker mediators working for me. We worked on, natural resources and finance issues, and public health problems. Some of it international. It took me to New Guinea and working for a big mining problem. Worked in Australia a lot. So we did a lot of international work, and it was challenging and fun and very engaging.
That's great. That's great. I can hear your passion for the work. Let's get into the work, actually, because you write so compellingly about the techniques and the lessons you've learned. Do you have the book in front of you? Do you mind if I ask you to read something?
Which book? I'm sorry.
Oh, this book, the Personal Histories book.
I don't have. I know. I have the article.
Oh, okay. Yeah, on the top of page 16, you've got a paragraph that starts, in the world of conflict management, the right stories done at the right time. Sorry, I sprung that on you, but I think this is great because obviously you've got a community of people here who are doing this work too. And I love the way that you talk about it. And I think I want to hear you talk more about it. So if you could read that paragraph, in the world of conflict management, read that paragraph in the beginning of the next paragraph.
I have to find it.
Okay, so I can read it for you.
Yeah,
if you want me to.
read it. So
Okay. I'll hit the key points. You said, in the world of conflict management, the right stories done at the right time with the right people, asked for and spoken in the right way, can crack open a problem and create new possibilities. And then the beginning of the next paragraph, you say, at the most mundane level, I think part of my job is kickstarting and managing often difficult discussions that enable the telling of old stories and the creation of new ones.
Yeah.
So I want you to talk about that again, stories as being central to kind of tying together all the work that you've done, because I think that's how you kind of frame the piece. So talk about that.
Thank you, Colin. So there's a little note in there about tertium quid, which is an old English notion of creating a new story. And it's a legal principle out of before Blackstone even, probably. I don't know when, Ricky might know. But tertium quid is basically the construction of a third story. And what we encounter all the time is at least two stories about what the world looks like, and getting people to tell that story and illuminate it for us is part of what we do. It's the communication function in the early moments of getting people to unfold a little bit and reveal, either privately or in a joint session of some kind. And the notion is that eventually the stage gets set for a new story of some kind, that is a story about the, how it's going to be from here on, or what the future will hold for us. So it's really in that context where we take, opposing stories sometimes and opposing truths, and really try to construct something new, a third one. And that's the tertium quid. And that's kind of what drives it for me. I like the stories. I like listening to people. I like hearing what they have to say up until they start dithering too much and repeating themselves. Which we all encounter. We all know that, there comes up, but we got one of the things I think we do is we're fairly patient, trying to be pretty patient at the start. So we learn. That's the curiosity, right? We want to hear a little bit more, and either sometimes privately or in across the table. And it's moving towards that new construction, that new constructed story that people say, here's the story of the future.
Well, I love somebody, their only iPhone on the Zoom call, but they talk about just Kem's phrase of dispute-seeking missile. And I think when people are telling the stories, I could see you kind of going, aha, let's go deeper in there. I mean, you write at the end of the chapter, you say, the challenges always start with, evoke stories, be patient, ask questions, keep both unwarranted optimism and unchecked pessimism at bay, and stay especially alert for places where pragmatic outcomes can be discussed. So that does sound like a little bit like the missile, And so the other thing you talk about is the solution braid. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sorry, say that again.
The solution braid. And I think you even talk about it in terms of Oponopono. There's the mediator is called a haku, which is the braided lei many Hawaiian people wear on their heads for important occasions. You say, you have instincts about what to do in a session, and then occasionally it's time for you to call the question and start the solution braid. Maybe you can speak to that.
Well, you hit it right on the nose. I mean, the braid is what we do in the construction of that tertium quid, that new story. We have to pull pieces of story one, story two, and sometimes many other stories together and try to weave those in a way that presents possibilities for people to agree to and sign on.
Sure.
And we don't know what the particulars are going to be until we've heard, everybody and gathered all the possibilities.
Right.
And at some point, we'll, start to say, would you consider this? Would you do that? If the other guy did this, would you do that? Would you consider this possibility over that possibility? Which one would be more important? You ask a bunch of questions that are all moving towards, and here's something actionable that we can come out of our discussions.
Absolutely. Another thing you talk about, which I love, you talk about face and you talk about silence. So I was wondering, let's talk about each of those. You say, living and working in a largely Asian and Oceanic culture, I'm particularly sensitive to saving, managing, and assuring face. Right. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, Hawaii has, my colleagues on here would know, we deal with, Asian and native Polynesian and native Hawaiian traditions here. And indigenous people and even non-indigenous people in Asia are very sensitive to shame and to guilt and to losing, dignity and propriety.
Yeah.
And so one of my little rules of thumb, which is I just try not to embarrass anybody across the table. And never do that. I don't mind talking hard talk with them privately.
Sure.
But I just don't want anybody to get embarrassed. And I think we're very sensitive to that here in Hawaii. We're very sensitive to that as mediators and even as arbitrators. Ricky does a lot of arbitration and is a very skilled arbitrator and was a judge. And But privately, you can ask tough questions. You can ask very hard questions
Right.
under a cone of silence, unless you have permission to bring it out. But publicly, it's about diplomacy.
Absolutely.
It's really about being diplomatic.
Yeah, that was one of the best books I've read in conflict resolution, is Think About Dignity. And when I was first trained, there wasn't a lot of talk about dignity. But the thing about dignity and respect is that it's not zero sum. You know, I can disagree with you, but I can disagree with you in a way that preserves your dignity, or I can disagree with you in a way that undermines your dignity. And, you know, that also gets to cultural assumptions too. I just think face is a very interesting way to think about that.
And if I can say, Colin, it's more than saving face. People think about the word saving face,
Sure.
but it's also about managing, because you're part of trying to work with a transition and a change. And so, you know, I think there's some kind of management, which I don't fully understand. I can't articulate it very well.
Well, but I think a lot of the current issues we have in the United States is that we can't disagree while letting the other person preserve their dignity. You have to undermine, no, the very values that you hold that make you think that way, those are wrong too. So, you know, and I think that that's what fuels people to behave erratically. You also talk about, and I want to come to silence because you talk about that too, but I know this is something you and I have talked about over the years. You quote Moynihan and saying everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And I think I saw a great training that you and Juliana did years ago that was talking about the use of scientific and technical information in complex multi-party disputes. And we had this whole discussion with Chris Honeyman about the fact engine and how can we surface facts and make facts, because that's so often, you know, people come in with certainty and they'll bring facts that back up their certainty. And then if you start to just people throw facts at each other, you're not making any progress. But what you say is you have to kind of create that confusion, that third story, that moment of, you know, I love change is important, you go first. Talk to me about sort of facts and sort of where your current thinking is about, you know, the role of truth.
I've been very interested in kind of how do you get people to move towards some kind of factual analysis jointly when they're in the heat and passion and throes of a major, you know, fight that's got everybody emotionally charged up. And so I've worked with Scott McCreery and Keith Mattson and others on this notion of joint fact finding. I don't think facts are everything at all. I think you know they represent a place to work, and they're a portal into the other issues. And they're not. It's not appropriate for all situations. And my best experience with it is working recently on the island of Kauai on a very tough case that involved genetically modified corn crops and seed company agriculture with, you know, DuPont and Dow and all the big shot guys and little farmers who thought they were being poisoned. And it took us a long time, and we put together a fact-finding group. And really, the starting point was to wade through a lot of the public testimony. And we actually made a kind of a chart and said, here are the allegations that have been raised about these genetically modified organisms and these plants. And they run from, you know, like we're poisoning the shoreline sea urchins all the way to, you know, the streams are being degraded. And then here are the responses. So we actually put a chart together, and once we got our little effort underway, we actually presented that and said, how can we fill, and in the middle column was blank. Said, what are the facts that could help us sort these out? These are the allegations. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work doing that. But these are the allegations, these are the responses, and not every allegation had a response, and not every response had a single allegation. But what are the facts that will be important to this group to try to gather as we search for some solutions to very specific issues? So, and I just want to say one more thing. The silence issue is a little different because that was a very personal learning over the years.
Yeah, talk to me about that.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned is to ask a question and then just shut up. And that was somewhat new because I used to ask a question and then fill it in when they didn't respond and keep asking.
Right.
And I've learned just shut up, you know, just stop, you know, don't, you know.
Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's awkward. Sometimes it's painful, but you gotta write out the silence. Yeah. And you said Ho'oponopono has timeouts, periods of intentional quiet, and moments when everyone must confront whatever responsibility they carry for the issue at hand.
Right.
So that's interesting too. Again, I think this is a cultural lesson.
The whole Oponopono analogy, as some of my colleagues would know, is the haku, the leader, the braider, will say this problem is an onion, and we're going to begin to peel away layers, and everybody's got links to at least one or more layers, and so they bear response. Now you got to remember, this whole Oponopono was very specialized. It wasn't for everything, but they had the Hawaiians, the older Hawaiians, believed that even some of the psychological problems had social origins. And so they would say, we're going to bring cousin in because cousin's got a problem. It's a problem, he's acting out, or he's in trouble with the police, or whatever, or he's just going, nuts, and he got into, and so these might go on for days in a big family quarrel. They would go on for days.
Wow.
These were not 1 hour sessions.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, and you do talk about this, is you kind of have to code switch a little bit. You said when you're working with business people, they don't seem to care for the word conflict or mediation. So then you use strategy development, internal alignment, project planning. It's still pretty much the same work. It's just you have to use different language. So I think talk a little bit about that when you go into a group, kind of figuring out what language or what framing is going to be. You say you're a dilemma manager. And I think some of that is the framework that you provide for people to think about their dilemmas. But how do you do that choosing when you get into a new dilemma?
So a lot of the languages has to be contextual. So if I'm working on a litigation matter that's in the court or headed into the court, and I start talking about mediation and interests and positions and explaining all that stuff and getting at that, at least the lawyers mostly understand that stuff. And they understand what they mean. They may be wrong in their views, but they have a notion of what mediation is.
Yeah.
In the political world and in the community world of these other kinds of conflicts, I think it's obscure, and so I have to change language. And I say, would you be interested in having a discussion, a kind of a conversation about the future of this particular problem? Yes. If I said, would you be interested in the mediation? They'd say no. No, we're not interested in that. Mediators are the people who turn us upside down and take money out of our pockets. And all those facilitators, they just put charts on the wall with colored pens and make me crazy. So I think, getting more adaptive in understanding the context in which we work is shifts the way we talk about things.
Yeah. I definitely found that too. When I first got to eBay, I said, well, you have a lot of disputes here. And people, no, we don't have disputes. We don't have disputes. So, oh, okay. Well, you have a lot of problems you need to go. Yeah, we have a lot of those. I mean, I talked to property tax assessors. Do you have any disputes? No. Do you have any appeals? Oh, yeah, we have tens of thousands of appeals. Okay. All right. So the framing matters. One other thing that I want to give it an opportunity to speak to, and I want to open it up because we have so many great people that I want to hear what they have to say too. So if you have any comments or questions for Peter, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. But also, we've got in a small enough group. I urge you to just unmute and say something. Benjamin, I'm going to come to you first because I already know you have something you want to say. But one of the great meetings in my dispute resolution career was the meeting you convened in Colorado when you were at Keystone, talking about, are we a field? And we brought a lot of people together to talk through this. And I know you, even before that meeting, you had a very strong opinion that we're not a field. Like, what is a field? Look at fields, look at professional fields. You can say who's in, you can say who's not. There's a certification exam, all those kinds of things. So I think a lot of other people at that meeting disagreed, and you still all the time, you hear people all the time, well, the mediation field, this is what we think, conflict resolution field. Has your opinions changed at all since that meeting in Colorado those years ago? Or why do you feel the way that you feel?
Well, I think I could argue it both ways, frankly. I think I could put on a pretty good debate on the other side. It says, of course, we're a field. So it all depends on what you mean by field. And I just don't think we're a very unified set of strands. And I saw that in ACR and SPIDER, the predecessor. We had these sectors and we had these groups, and there was more affinity in those groups than there was in some sense of the whole. And so I continue to think if we're a field, it's very chaotic, and it's not, we're not a profession exactly. We don't have the certifications and all those things that go along with that. So I think if we're a field, it's very inchoate. It's spread out. It doesn't mean that there aren't relationships. In that debate, Juliana and I took, I said we're not a field. She said we were.
Right.
And then Carrie Menkel-Meadow was there. And she said, you know what? It's a calling. We're a calling.
Calling.
We're a calling. People get called for this kind of work, or it's adjunctive, and they may have different caliber levels of calling for it. And, some are like head over heels of it, like me and many of you guys. And others say, no, I'm called to it as a part of my other work. I'm a lawyer, but I love working on settlements at the right moment, at the right time. So I just think, I don't think we're very unified. And I always noticed at those meetings that the family people all huddled together and the environmental people all huddled together and the construction people huddled together. And that's where they got a lot of exuberance and a lot of joy and a lot of really insight. So to me, I've always said, yeah, okay, kind of, sort of. And my nemesis in this debate is Bernie Mayer. He and I are very close friends, and we debate this. And as you know, if you've read his books, he says, well, the field should do this and the field should do that, and the field needs to grapple with this, and we need to become more accountable. Benjamin does the same thing. The field should be this. And I'm going, I don't think so. I don't know. I'm not very persuaded. The first church of mediation, I don't think so.
Well, I'm going to give Benjamin a rebuttal right now, but
of course,
I sort of find myself with a foot in each camp. I like thinking of us as a practice. I like thinking of us, there's sort of skills, there's sort of techniques, there's sort of lessons, there's the art of it, there's the science of it. But I've met people who've never had a mediation training who are incredible mediators.
Exactly.
And I've met people who have done mediation and they say, I'm a professional, I have all these credentials, I have all these certifications, and I watch them do their thing and I'm like, wow, no, that's not what I think this is. So Benjamin, what do you think about all of this?
Wait, let me put on my seatbelt.
Yeah. Oh, you got to unmute, Robert.
As an initial segue, I think that the thing I want to say is I dispute Mr. Adler's characterization of me in terms of the field controversy. I would offer that, and just to throw it out because it isn't my main focus right this second, is that it's a thinking frame, and that in light of how the world is changing and dealing with levels of uncertainty that I don't think we've ever really had coalesce together with separate existential issues all at the same time, I do think that it's going to be more incumbent upon us and mediators on some level, for all the reasons Peter said, is forced to deal with uncertainties, with different cultures, with whole different alternative realities. And how do you put those together? And the best of what I think we do as mediators is learn the kind of necessary flexibility and discipline to think more creatively, laterally. And that's where it comes in. I heard a number of things that Peter will be surprised to hear, new developments in my thinking about tricksters and the notion of that folkloric figure. And much of what Peter Adler does. He is a preeminent trickster figure in the best sense of the word, coming in and shifting the language, shifting the frame, forming the narrative, using in alternatively forms of constructively forms of deception and forms of just recharacterizations and stuff like that. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to turn it. And my question to you, Peter, is, I think most importantly, because it's got to be on everybody's mind for the relevance in the future of the field, is how the hell would you handle one of these quantum political disputes? We had people in front of you, quantum political issues. How would you approach dealing with, for lack of a better term, a Trumpian characterization of the world and a progressive one? And what would be the first thinking if you were going into the room as a thought experiment? I'm sure you've thought about it. How would I handle this as you've watched the news and got increasingly aggravated, perhaps with both sides? But just in terms of what you would hope for in terms of the world So it becomes an existential issue, future of democracy, future of the planet, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me how you would apply your thinking, all of your experience and what you've learned in your life experience to where you are now, how you would approach that.
So
Quantum
yeah,
mediation.
I always really enjoyed, Bob and I have done a lot of workshops together in which he's Mr. Bad Guy and I'm Mr. Good Guy. Or sometimes we reverse roles and I'm the bad guy and he's the good guy. And so we had a lot of fun doing that kind of trickery, if you will, in workshops. And, for me, I'm still reading and learning more about quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And I don't claim to be mathematically organized and, or at least not very well, but I can, I'm trying to understand the principles. And one of the first principles in the quantum world is that things are waves. Waves come in, waves go out, waves move around. And we tend to think of particles and very specific motions. So the question is, where are we on the wave? Where are we in the wave? And where is there any kind of little opportunity for some kind of guerrilla mediation or guerrilla negotiation, small entry points? We're not going to create a grand bargain out of this mess. That's not going to be our job. But if I was trying to work with any of them, if I was actually invited to do so, and I wouldn't do it otherwise, I would pull together some very small sidebar meetings and begin to explore the problems and the solutions. And again, sometimes the problems are more interesting than the rapid fire solutions, which people want from us. They want fixes. They want us to move straight to the fix. And sometimes the marinating in the problem is more interesting. So if I could get, a couple of the Biden people and a couple of the right Republican people together, I would explore that. I'll tell you one other strategy that actually was used when we were at Keystone. We had a very distinguished board of directors from corporations and nonprofit and big ones, the kind of Dow company with the Sierra Club and all those counterparts. And at one point we had a guy named Roger Schlickheisen, who was head of the Wilderness Society, or whatever it was called then, on our board, and along with a guy who was one of the forest industry business reps. And they had been used to dealing with each other for years and years and years and fighting in 10-minute position papers, but they would go to the bar and drink together and they become good friends. And they were both on our board. And we started talking about the possibility of putting together a dialogue, a right kind of dialogue. And that's what we called it, a dialogue on fixes to the jeopardy and critical habitat sections of the Endangered Species Act. And what we wound up doing, working carefully with these two distinguished guys, we wrangled an invitation from Hillary Clinton, who was in the Senate then, and James Inhofe, who was also in the Senate, and Blanche Lincoln, signed by 6 of them, asking Keystone to create the right kind of discussion. It was very general. In fact, I wrote the letter to me and gave it to them as a draft. So, I was trying to we were pretty cagey about this. And I think you got to be pretty cagey about this and find those little small moments and small openings. There's no grand bargain that's going to happen. We're in a wave. We're at a point in the wave where that grand bargain is going to have to, they're going to have to do some fighting. They have to fight it out. And the fight will take place in many different ways and electorally and rhetorically. But I'm always looking for those little small openings when I can put my dispute missile thing together. And I don't mind being pretty crafty and cagey about that in the political arena, different in the court context very often, although maybe that has its own craftiness too.
Well, let me ask just one quick follow-up, if you'll allow it, Colin, is it,
Sure.
I know that you wrote a paper some years ago, and it seems to me that it's one of the pieces that does in some ways summarize how you think about things, the protean mediator, and borrowing from Robert Lifton and his concept of the protean self, where he's, I think, presciently talked about how we're going to, the evolution of new kinds of approaches to a thinking frame, which requires, and at least there's some sense of that in the practice of mediation, being protean. What does it mean to you now as you look back on that? Does that concept still work for you? And how much have you employed it in your thinking?
Yeah, it does. I really recommend that book. I mean, it's one that Bob and I have talked a lot about and did some workshops on, and it's called The Protean Self by Robert J. Lifton, who was a historian. He called himself a psychohistorian because he was really interested in the big formulations of identity in different historic eras. And he basically said 25, 30 years ago, there's a new kind of person in the world. And that person is not a jihadist or a fundamentalist or, made of one thing. They're people who have multiple sides. It means they're shapeshifters. And that's what we have to become in order to do this work in that kind of way. So I still really think that way, that we're, and that's part of your trickery notion, trickster notion, that we have to be shapeshifters. At one moment, we are like a compassionate ear, and the next moment, we're, playing in the hardball game. We're asking really hard, pushing people hard for, solutions and stop dithering and let's get down to it. But that comes way late. So I do still think of that protean self as a guidance, as a pillar for me. And I know it is for you too.
Yeah, I had a very senior mediator tell me once, I think they're on this call, that mediation is benevolent manipulation. And I think there's an element of, you got to shape the dispute. You're not there to sit there and watch, you got to get in there. And I love Bob's notion of the trickster, but I also love, all the different ways that you talk about engaging and shaping too, Peter. Let me go to some of the comments in the chat. Jim asked, do you think that old farts can help to effectively resolve conflicts or facilitate agreements, particularly online? How has the emergence of online changed your practice and opened opportunities?
That's a very Melamed question. That is such a Jim Melamed question. It's so characteristic. And I know, Jim, and you are very much at the vanguard and in the forefront of thinking about the online world and how mediation moves into that world in its many different forms.
Well, make it personal for you. How has the technology changed your practice? And you're doing a chord 3. It's amazing. That wouldn't be possible without all this tech.
To me, they're tools. They're just tools and techniques and usable techniques that, again, can be adapted into the moment. I've been, having been locked up in COVID and sequestered for the last, whatever it is, year, more than a year. I recently did a labor management mediation, a precursor to a long collective bargaining negotiation. And they wanted to meet face to face. And we did that. And I can't tell you how delightful it was, how nice it was to actually have people in the room and have people sitting there together and having a coffee or having a beer late in the afternoon as we work through a series of very tough issues that will have to be bargained over on pay and all the things that labor unions and managers work on. But they developed an approach. They actually planned out their collective bargaining strategy, how they were going to involve other people. They created a code of excellence for what they were going to do. They created some very specific protocols. And it was just delightful to be in an actual room with people. And I think there's a part of us that still hungers for that. And I know you guys, you and Jim, are very, very taken. And I think you guys are doing an amazing job of cultivating possible tools and techniques. And I think those things will, this Zoom is not going to go away. I mean, even as everybody gets vaccinated, it's here to stay. But it will become more and more hybrid, I think, with face-to-face. So I'm very optimistic about what you guys are doing, and you're at the vanguard of that, Colin and Jim. You're right out there. You and your colleagues are doing it.
Great. I'm cutting that out and I'm putting it on the homepage of mediate.com.
There you go.
So that was all I wanted from this whole session, was just that little. So Rick asked, can you talk about some experiences with pivoting? Pivoting to new information, especially when that new information appears to contradict what preceded it.
Can you say a little more about that question?
Rick, do you want to unmute and elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. Part of what you may have missed, Peter, was I think Colin may have frozen up as he did on my screen for a moment. But I think I was just saying, when the information comes suddenly, where it seems to or apparently contradicts what has gone on before, and there's there's a flow, a momentum going in one direction, and then suddenly there's a new piece of information that is really startling. I've known as myself as a mediator, it's sometimes really tough to really pivot and accept that as a pillar that I need to readjust and adjust to. And I was wondering if you have any experiences about that and how you're able to do it, constantly being aware and the flexibility it's a new kind of flexibility. Can you really adapt to that sudden shot from the side or coming out of nowhere?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't know that I have a really perfect answer to it at all. I was actually moderating, it wasn't mediating. I was moderating a thing in DC years ago when I was at the Keystone Center on bipartisanship. And the woman who was I think it was Nancy Johnson, who was from Connecticut at that time. I asked them, what changes things for you guys when you're trying to work a deal? What changes? And she said, new information comes on the table and it gives everybody a chance to stop, absorb, reflect, and gives people the pretext for the changes they may want to make. And I don't know that that's true in every situation, but I was struck by that because new data, new information comes across the table and it represents a piece. If there's a wave, if this is wave notion, then all of a sudden there's this moment when we can stop things the way they are and take a look at, that new piece of information or data that's just emerged and give people a chance to reflect on it privately first, because we know that facts don't actually change opinions. We know that already. But what facts do is they present a moment. And what really does seem to make a difference is discussions among trustworthy people, trusted people, which we can build. We can help build those in a particular context. So I don't know if I'm, Rick, I don't know if I'm answering your question very directly.
Peter, I thought that was great because what it reminds me of, it harkens to one or two experiences where I had, where they're really opportunities. So rather than seeing them as threats, if I'm able to really look at it as, and have the people that I'm working with engage with it in a way as seeing it as an opportunity. I can't use that word with them, but emotionally, if I'm able to open that up as a crack in a different shell or however we may see it, I think that's what's worked for me. When I've been able to do that, I've been able to not see it as a threat or as a challenge, but really as a new piece, as an opportunity and something that I can really appreciate in a very different light. And it's easier to say that now in reflection, but I know that emotionally sometimes I've been caught by surprise, and it's one of my more difficult things sometimes. So thank you.
Just one last piece on that. During that GMO flap that I worked on for so many months, while we were at the table working as this group to try to resolve certain questions, we framed the questions about, what are the impacts of GMOs on environmental health, human health, and we were trying to gather information around that. And during the pendency of that, along comes a lot of new information about Roundup and glyphosate, which is, posed more of a problem than anybody thought. And so that was this moment when everybody had to, go back to their stalls and back to their rooms and do a little reflection on it. And people came back and said, it doesn't matter. It's, these studies are unverified, but it gave everybody a pause. And maybe it's the pause that is important there. Anyway.
I want to also surface something from the chat that Lucia said. I think this talking before about sort of being engaged with these cases. She said she likes to stay away from the word neutral. She prefers impartial. She thinks that neutral implies passivity, like a car being in neutral. Right. And she says it's better for a mediator, a conflict specialist, to be engaged and active. And I know we were talking before about Bernie's new book with Jackie is called The Neutrality Trap. Right. I was just wondering if you wanted to speak to that.
I totally agree with Lucia on this because my sense is the word neutral, characterizing ourselves as neutrals, works in the context of court cases. And it's less salient and less relevant outside the court context. So the word I like is I say, you know, I'm committed to being independent. And at any time you guys can call me on it if you think I'm not being, but that's my mantra. But if it's a litigation matter, I will declare a neutrality because that's their language. That's the language that people know in the courthouse when it comes to settlement and when it comes to negotiations.
Yeah,
So
Lucia, did
again,
you want
I think
to?
it's using this contextually, depending on where we are, rather than as a one size fits all.
Yeah, I think that this idea of the way that our job is to listen deeply to, the way I describe it to people is, as a mediator, my job is to listen to people like they have never been listened to before. And it is transformative and it is healing. And it is, while mediation is not therapy, and I'm very careful to say that, it can be therapeutic because people haven't been listened to at that level before. And that is anything but passive. In fact, it is exhausting, which is why you can't do, even when we were doing our mediations, when we would have the one big day, right, that was scheduled 6 months in advance, we didn't do 5 mediations a week for 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. We would collapse because it is not passive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I saw in one of my earliest trainings, I think, was when I was trained by the Friends. They said mediation is mostly listening, and it's not passive listening. It's not the way you just listen to music. It's active listening. And we use that phrase, we throw it around, active listening, as if, oh yeah, it just means you center and you look in somebody's eyes. No, it's a lot more than that. It
Yeah,
really
or
is.
just, it's not just repeating what they just said either. It is getting, it is hearing what they're saying, what they're not saying, and the spaces in between. The what they're saying, and then the meta, the why it's important to them, and then what they're leaving out. And you really got to pay attention to do that. And it's exhausting.
It is, it is. I actually hear fewer people, you know, obviously there's neutrality and the neutrality myth and Sarah Cobb and, you know, talking about impartiality, but I hear more and more people talking about omnipartiality. And I kind of like that. There's something that resonates with me. It's like, you know, it's not that I'm partial to anybody in the room. I'm partial to everybody in the room. We all want to find a solution, and that's, so I don't know if Peter, if that resonates with you.
It might, with the right people in the right place, the right time. My sense is, again, simplicity of language and trying to get there, characterize what we're going to do, regardless of whatever the written statements and submission agreements are, the charters or whatever it is. So the term might be right for some situations, and I don't know which ones those are. But in the court cases, I'm a neutral, and outside that, I'm independent. And both of those have written formulations around them that I'll give to people as an agreement.
That's my practice takeaway from what I've heard you say today, is this ability to figure out what's the language and the framing that works with this conversation, with this dialogue. And we can't get married to any one framing and say, well, this is a true framing, so you need to change your framing and use my framing. No, you have to come in and figure out what's the way to ask the question the right way. What's the way to package it so that they get to that moment of, you know, where they're introduced anew. So I think that's great. Well, Peter, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to use to wrap this up? I've got another thing that I want to say before we tie a bow on it.
Just one more brief thing. And one is that I was really honored to be a part of the book that Howard and Nancy did. I was very honored. It came out of the blue, and it was terrific. And it really provoked a lot of thinking on my part. I had to kind of look back and figure out all the trails that have led to the present. And I'm very honored. You do me honor by doing this 1 hour conversation. So thank you, Colin.
Oh, well, please, the honor is all ours. I feel the same way about this book. As I say every time I do these, I'm obsessed with this book. I love it. I wish that we could have this for every mediator in the field. I want it to just keep growing and growing. We need 20 volumes of this book. But Peter, you know, what I normally do when I wrap these up is I take sort of a closing paragraph from the chapter. But actually, I found something that I really liked in this book, your other book about Peace Corps. And it's a poem that you put at the end. It's a Marjorie Piercy poem called To Be of Use. And let me just read it quickly. It says, the work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine and oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. And I really feel that made me think a lot about you and about your career. And I think this is written in the context of you at the beginning of your career. But I think all of us on this call are wannabe pitchers. And I think we can recognize in you a pitcher, that you found your water to carry, and you lived a life of great use. And I hope you feel the satisfaction there. And I hope you feel from all of us who are trying to work in similar areas, our appreciation for all the great work you've done and the model you've set for us. So I want to thank you for taking the time for being with us today and for this conversation. So could everybody join me in a round of applause for Peter?
Jesus.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye-bye.